All right, y'all. So I wanted to do another episode of the podcast. Went in to use the usual app that I use, and it was not what I used to use. So had to find another app to use to make my podcast. Somebody got me hip to Podbean. So this is my first episode recording using Podbean. We'll see how it goes. All right. So reason I wanted to do an episode is I was on scrolling social media yesterday, and there's still this debate about Angel Reese versus Caitlin Clark, and that whole debate about who really brought eyes to the WNBA and this and that. So the title of this episode, I should say, is going to be Angel Reese, quote unquote, versus Caitlin Clark. The reason that the versus is quote unquote is because they're not really against each other, right? They both bring eyes to the WNBA for whatever reason. If you love Caitlin Clark, if you love Angel Reese, if you hate Caitlin Clark, if you hate Angel Reese, you're still watching what they're doing, right? I'm just going to give my opinion on a situation, and some people are going to agree, some people won't disagree. That's the nature of having an opinion, right? So, in my opinion, as someone that was not into the WNBA heavily before both of them came into the league, I'm going to say that both of them have equal influence on drawing new eyes to the league. Notice I say new eyes. WNBA has been around for a while. There have been fans. There have been eyes on the league, especially with the likes of Candace Parker, Maya Moore, Asia Wilson, Lisa Leslie. There are eyes. There have been eyes on the WNBA. I think that Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark have brought new eyes to the sport. This is what I'm going to say, though. For me personally, I think what thrust Caitlyn into the national spotlight was the incident, quote unquote, between her and Angel, where Angel gave her the "you can't see me" in the title game, and the holding up her hand and tapping the ring finger. That's when I found out who Caitlin Clark was. Obviously, some Iowa women's basketball fans knew who Caitlin Clark was since day one. Follow her. Some more heavily involved people in the sport probably knew who Caitlin Clark was. For me personally, I believe that snapshot, if you will, in women's basketball is what thrust Caitlin Clark into the national spotlight. So, with that, I'm also going to say this. I also think that thrusts Angel Reese into the national spotlight. Did I know who Angel Reese was before that? A little bit, not very much. But for good or bad, I think that incident thrust both of them into the national spotlight. Some people hated on Angel because she did it. Oh my gosh, why would she do that? But people also failed to acknowledge that Caitlyn had done it the week before. So I think that we need to hold both of these women accountable if you're going to say, oh my gosh, why would one do it? Well, the other one also did it. So be equal in your I'm going to say disgust, but that's not a good word, but be equal in your upsetness of one doing it if the other one did it as well. So, in the interest of progressing this conversation, who brings more eyes to the WNBA? I mean, me personally, I like watching the WNBA because I feel like it is more fundamental basketball. It's more team basketball. It's more true in the essence of basketball, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Um, the NBA, I think, has become washed and it's all about threes. And, I just don't think it's as fun to watch. And I think that their numbers dipping has proved that. Um, I like basketball in its purest form, and I feel like the WNBA is closer to that. Did Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark bring me personally into the fold? Yes, I will absolutely give both of them credit for bringing me into the fold. Um, there are some people that say CC brought them into the fold. Some people that say Angel Reese brought them into the fold. I'm going to give both of those women credit for bringing me into the fold because I'm going to reference it back to the title game where you can't see me, the ring. That's where we'll put both of them on my radar personally. Um, you don't have to give both of them women credit. You can give one or the other credit. I'm going to give both of them credit. They both have unique games. They both bring something special to the WNBA. They both set rookie records. They both did their thing their rookie season. I'm not a CC hater. I'm not an Angel hater. None of that. I want both of them to have successful careers. I want both of them to ball out. I think it's great for women's basketball. I personally like both of their games because they're unapologetically themselves. They talk their trash. They back it up. They're not afraid to show, that girls can talk trash too, that women, they like to be rah-rah too. And I feel like that is a stigma that we need to get over as a society, is that women in sports are supposed to be like women in everyday life where, you expect them to be quote unquote classy or quote unquote feminine or whatever have you. Sports is sports. Whether it's a man playing it, whether it's a woman playing it, whether it's a boy playing it, a girl playing it, sports is sports. It's competitive. You get your blood rushing. You get in the heat of the moment. You do stuff. You say stuff. You react. Holding women to a different standard than you do men is just not okay in my book. I've coached girls basketball. I've coached football. For me personally, I enjoyed coaching girls basketball more because at some points, because I'll say that it seemed like the young ladies I was coaching worked a little bit harder. They complained a little bit less. And I'm a football player. I've been a football player since I was a little kid. So I'm not just saying this out of ignorance. I've been around football for 2 decades. So I'm very well versed in football when I say this. And I've played multiple other sports. Boys can be big babies. I'll be the first to admit it. And I feel like in my seasons coaching girls basketball, women's basketball, whatever have you, it was at the high school level. So whichever one we want to go by, there wasn't as much complaining. They worked hard. They showed up, and they did this without having as many fans in the stands as a boys' basketball game would have. So I had even more respect for those young ladies that they still showed up. They still put in that work. They still were a part of that athlete grind. So, with all that being said, both of these women have brought eyes to the sport. The likes of Juju Watkins, Paige Beckers, Cameron Brink, all these other names that are coming with this new wave of talent are bringing eyes to the WNBA. And I think it does a disservice to all of these women to say, oh, well, Cece brought all the eyes. Oh, well, Angel brought all the eyes. No, this new wave of talent is bringing eyes to college women's basketball as well as the WNBA, and I am here for it. I'm absolutely here for it. So, be a fan, be a hater. As long as you're watching, it is what it is. And that's what I got to say on that matter. Let's go on to something else. So, something else that I wanted to talk about in this episode, and I'm just gonna dip my toe in it. The votes have already been cast, but NFL MVP. I'm also going to touch a little bit on Offensive Player of the Year because I feel like that kind of molds into my argument as well. I will admit I'm a Bills fan. It's hard to take my bias out of it, but I do try to speak unbiased when I do have these kind of conversations. You can believe me, you cannot believe me. It is what it is. But this is what I believe about the Most Valuable Player Award. Most Valuable Player should go to the most valuable player on a good team, right? My argument for Josh Allen is he was the captain of a team that beat both number one seeds in the regular season. Um, he was, without a question, the most valuable player on that team. They were the number two seed in the AFC. Set multiple records. First quarterback to have 3 and 3 rushing, 3 passing. First quarterback to have a rushing, a passing, and a receiving touchdown in the game. And you can argue that he did it with quote unquote no support. None of his receivers hit 1,000 yards. I think regular season James Cook just was over 1,000 yards. Yes, James Cook absolutely had a lot of touchdowns. So got to give him credit on that. But statistically speaking, before all these people started bowing out of the Pro Bowl, there were no Pro Bowlers on that team that helped him. Whereas the case for Lamar, you have 9 Pro Bowlers on that team. Yes, Lamar absolutely shattered some statistical records, but they were they were a wild card team, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that. Don't come from me if I am mistaken on that. But no, that's wrong. I lied. They did win their division. So I'm sorry. They won their division, so they were a 3 or 4 seed. 3, I believe, because I think the Texans were 4. So you were the third seeded team. With that, I think you guys lost 3 or 4 games, somewhere 3, 4, 5, somewhere in that range, right? Yes, Lamar went off, but he also had the number 2 running back in the backfield. He had a Pro Bowl wide receiver. I think what were they? The number 1 or 2 rush defense. So he had help. He had help, and still their record wasn't as good as the Bills. So his team was not as good. Can you argue that Lamar Jackson was the most valuable piece of his team? Yes, you can absolutely make that argument, but you can also argue for Derrick Henry being a valuable part of that team. So when you can argue that somebody else on somebody's team has a significant amount of value, especially since he was a number 2 running back in the league, I personally feel like that diminishes the argument for most valuable player. I also think that you have to factor in the team's record, right? The reason Joe Burrow wasn't really heavy into the MVP race is because the Bengals weren't very good. The Bengals, didn't make the playoffs. But if we're being honest, statistically, Joe Burrow had, I believe, his best statistical season. Joe Burrow wasn't the reason that the Bengals weren't winning. Joe Burrow had a great season. But the reason people weren't factoring him into the conversation was because of his team's lack of success. So we can't have that measurement for one player and not factor that in with the top 2 guys in terms of Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. So this is why I said I'm going to bring in Offensive Player of the Year. So MVP, I believe, should go to the most valuable person on arguably one of the top teams. In my opinion, that's Josh Allen, easily the most valuable person on the Bills. Bills were the number 2 seeded team in the AFC, beat both number 1 seeds in the regular season. It's a regular season award, so we don't factor in the playoffs. Offensive Player of the Year, I believe, is the statistical award. The best offensive player, and they had the best stats. When it comes to that award, I believe it's between Lamar Jackson and Saquon Barkley. I believe that both of them have very equal rights to this argument. Were it not for Saquon sitting out that last week, he probably would have shattered, not just broken, shattered the single season rushing record, because he was averaging what, $130 a game rushing. So he was what, 108 or 109 away from it going into that game. So it's argued that he would have shattered it by maybe 50 yards. And if you don't realize, 50 yards is a lot of yards. So if he doesn't sit out that last week, he might break that record. Lamar had probably his best season as a pro. Top numbers in terms of efficiency. What did he have? 4,000 rushing yards, almost 1,000, or 4,000 passing yards, almost 1,000 rushing yards. Accounted for, I think, 30 plus passing touchdowns. I want to say it was 40, but don't quote me on it. I know it was 30 plus for sure. 30 plus rushing or passing touchdowns. So Offensive Player of the Year, I believe, is the statistical trophy or award. It should go to what offensive player had the best statistical season, in which you argue Lamar or Saquon. MVP, I feel, is who is the most valuable player to one of the best teams. And in that argument, you have Josh Allen, absolutely Lamar Jackson, and then you have Saquon Barkley. But when you factor in things like team's record and success against top teams, I think that puts Josh Allen just a little bit above the other 2, because they were the number 2 seed and they beat the number 1 seed in both divisions. Yes, they lost to the Ravens in week 4, but I mean, that was week 4. It's a 17-week season. I mean, the Ravens lost to the Steelers. I think they split with the Browns, but don't quote me on that. They split the Browns with the Bengals. Don't quote me on that, because I'm not looking at it right now, but I'm pretty sure they split with one of those 2 teams. So if you're really going to hold that against teams, then I mean, okay, the The Bills lost to a team that was the number 3 ranked team in the AFC. I mean, the number 2 overall run. Like, yes, the regular season award, they lost the Ravens. It is what it is. That was early on. You can't factor in that more than you factor in Lamar's losses if that's the argument you want to make. Lamar's losses, in my opinion, are to a less caliber teams or less caliber talent of teams. So that is my final stance on that, is that I believe Josh Allen is MVP because you have to factor in team records, and that puts him up a little bit above the other two. Offensive Player of the Year, I think, is the statistical award where it could justifiably go to Lamar or Saquon. All right, so that's just what I wanted to make this episode about, was Angel Reese, quote unquote, versus Caitlin Clark. Even though it's not really a versus, give both of these ladies their flowers. They did great things for college basketball. They carried over to the WNBA, and I am very excited to see where both of their careers go. I will wholeheartedly admit that both of them are the reason I watched the WNBA and got into the WNBA. Yes, I adopted the Sky because I am more so an Angel Reese fan, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't checking in on what the Fever were doing, making sure that Caitlin Clark was going off. I'm a big Asia Wilson fan. Love what the Aces were doing. So I adopted a few teams in terms of the Sky and the Aces. Give both of these ladies their flowers for the eyes that they brought to the league. All right. And then as far as MVP, Josh Allen is my MVP, and that's me trying not to be biased as a Bills fan. And then Offensive Player of the Year is Lamar or Saquon. I can't really pick one on that. That one I would maybe do a dual Offensive Player of the Year because they both had statistical seasons, great statistical seasons. I mean, I guess if I had to pick, and we can't do a co-offensive player of the year, I can't justifiably give it to Saquon because he didn't break the record. But the year that Adrian Peterson almost broke the record, he won the MVP. So I don't know. I'm going to go co-offensive player of the year, so I don't have to pick. Josh Allen's my MVP. Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark deserve their flowers for bringing new pairs of eyes to the WNBA. And that's all I got to say on the matter. So go ahead and rack this episode of the Limitless podcast, and I'll catch y'all next time.